Most painters feared winter. The days became shorter. The colors faded. The landscape seemed to lose the very thing painters depended upon: light. But along the northern coast of Europe, a small group of artists made a remarkable decision. Instead of escaping the darkness, they walked directly into it. They stood on frozen beaches. They painted beneath skies that barely seemed awake. They waited for evenings that lasted longer than afternoons. Not because those landscapes were beautiful in the conventional sense, but because something happened there that they could not explain. People behaved differently. Silence felt heavier. Time appeared to slow. Thought itself became quieter. Without knowing it, these painters were observing something that psychologists and neuroscientists would only begin to understand more than a century later. Light does far more than illuminate the world. It quietly shapes the way we experience reality. Today, we often think of Impressionism as the celebration of sunlight, of gardens, rivers, summer afternoons. But that is only half the story. Because at the northern edge of Europe, another form of Impressionism was taking shape. One that did not ask how light changes a landscape, but how it changes the human mind. And once you see what these artists discovered, their paintings never feel silent again. By the final decades of the 19th century, Impressionism had spread far beyond France. Artists traveled constantly. Ideas crossed borders almost as quickly as trains. Paris had become the center of modern painting, and young artists from across Europe arrived eager to learn its revolutionary language. They studied broken brushstrokes. They abandoned polished academic surfaces. They carried their easels outdoors. Above all, they learned to paint light as something alive. It seemed like a universal discovery. Wherever sunlight existed, Impressionism could follow. Or so everyone believed. Then the movement reached Scandinavia, and almost immediately something unexpected happened. Northern Europe did not offer the generous sunlight of France. Its winters stretched across months. The sun rose reluctantly. Sometimes it barely climbed above the horizon before disappearing again. Snow erased color. Mist dissolved distance. Entire afternoons seemed suspended between daylight and evening. The French methods still worked, but the experience no longer did, because these artists were no longer observing abundance. They were living inside scarcity. And scarcity changes perception, not only visually, psychologically. Modern neuroscience now tells us that prolonged exposure to reduced daylight influences attention, memory, emotional regulation, and even our perception of time. But these painters did not need laboratories to notice the effect. They experienced it every winter. The world itself seemed to become slower. Conversations softened. Footsteps disappeared beneath snow. The horizon dissolved into pale air. Even familiar places felt strangely unfamiliar. Painting under these conditions required something more than technical skill. It required learning to see differently. And this is where the story quietly changes, because the Nordic painters were no longer asking the same question as the French Impressionists. Monet asked, "What does light do to objects?" The Scandinavians began asking something far more unsettling. What does light do to us? That single shift transformed everything. The landscape stopped being the subject. It became a mirror, a place where emotion, memory, and perception slowly emerged through atmosphere rather than action. If you stand before many Nordic paintings today, very little seems to happen. A figure walks beside the sea. Someone waits at the edge of a beach. A house sits beneath an enormous sky. Nothing dramatic occurs. And yet many viewers find themselves unable to look away. Why? Because these paintings are not asking us to observe events. They are inviting us to recognize states of mind. The answer was hidden in plain sight. For generations, people believed these artists painted quiet landscapes. In reality, they were painting quiet consciousness. And nowhere would that discovery become more visible than in a tiny fishing village at the very top of Denmark, a place where the sea, the sky, and even the boundaries of perception began to disappear. There is a place in Denmark where two seas meet. The waters of the Skagen and the Kattegat collide just beyond a narrow spit of sand. The wind never seems to settle. The air carries salt, mist, and constantly shifting reflections. And for much of the year, the horizon appears almost impossible to define. That place is Skagen. By the late 19th century, it had become one of the most unusual artistic communities in Europe. Not because it offered dramatic mountains, not because it possessed ancient monuments, but because it possessed a kind of light that seemed to dissolve certainty itself. Painters from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden gathered there almost every summer. They shared meals, argued about painting, worked outdoors from dawn until dusk. Many had studied in Paris. Many admired Claude Monet. Yet none of them returned from Skagen painting quite the way they had before. What historians rarely mention is that they were confronting an environment unlike almost any other in European art. The landscape was astonishingly open. There were few trees, almost no hills, nothing to interrupt the meeting of sea and sky. Without strong visual boundaries, the eye behaves differently. Modern perceptual psychology suggests that when our surroundings contain fewer fixed reference points, attention becomes less focused on individual objects and more sensitive to atmosphere, distance, and subtle changes in light. The mind begins to experience space differently, less as a collection of things, more as a continuous field. You have probably experienced something similar yourself, standing beside an endless ocean, looking into dense fog, watching snow erase the edges of a familiar landscape. For a brief moment, your thoughts become quieter. Not because you choose silence, because the environment gently encourages it. The painters of Skagen could not have described this in scientific language, but they recognized it immediately. Their canvases became records of that experience. Look closely at many of their works. The figures rarely dominate the composition. Instead, they seem absorbed by the landscape. The sky feels larger than the people, the sea more permanent than the lives unfolding beside it. Human beings are no longer the center of the world. They become participants within something far greater. This was not simply a stylistic decision. It reflected an entirely different understanding of existence. Nature was no longer scenery. It became psychology. And this is where the painting stops being about art. Because the artists of Skagen had stumbled onto a truth that neuroscience would later confirm. Our surroundings do not merely influence what we see. They quietly influence who we become while we are seeing. Among all the painters who gathered there, one would devote his life to capturing the most elusive moment of all. Not sunrise, not daylight, but the few extraordinary minutes when day quietly surrenders to night. That painter was Peder Severin Krøyer. Few artists of his generation possessed greater technical brilliance. He had mastered academic drawing. He had traveled through Europe. He had absorbed the lessons of French Impressionism directly from their source. By every expectation, he should have become another painter of sunlight. Instead, he became the painter of its disappearance. Again and again, Krøyer returned to the same fragile moment. Evening, just after sunset, when the world seems suspended between visibility and memory. Today we call it the blue hour. To him it became an obsession. His famous beach scenes appear almost effortless. Friends walking beside the sea, his wife standing quietly near the shoreline. Children moving across wet sand. At first glance, very little happens. But the longer you remain with them, the stranger they become. The blue light softens every boundary. Faces lose sharpness. The sea reflects the sky until both seem almost indistinguishable. Even the figures appear detached from ordinary time. They are present, yet emotionally elsewhere. For centuries, everyone admired these paintings for their beauty. But here is what no one talks about. The emotional power of the blue hour may have very little to do with painting itself. It may begin inside the human brain. As daylight fades, our visual system gradually shifts from cone-dominated vision, which perceives rich color, to rod-dominated vision, which is more sensitive to low light but less responsive to warm tones. Blues and cool grays begin to dominate our perception. Edges soften. Contrast diminishes. The world becomes visually quieter. Something similar often happens emotionally. Transitions invite reflection. Endings invite memory. The close of day naturally encourages the mind to turn inward. It is one reason sunsets have inspired artists, poets, and musicians across cultures for centuries. Krøyer understood this without equations, without laboratories, without neuroscience. He understood it simply by watching. His paintings never force emotion upon us. They create conditions in which emotion quietly emerges. The silence belongs to the viewer. The memory belongs to the viewer. The longing belongs to the viewer. And that may explain why these works continue to feel so modern. They leave space for our own consciousness to enter the image. But Krøyer was not painting melancholy for its own sake. He was approaching something even more elusive, a feeling that Scandinavians have struggled to translate into other languages for generations. A feeling that would become one of the hidden emotional foundations of Nordic art. There is a Scandinavian word that has no exact equivalent in English. It is Veod. It is often translated as melancholy, but that translation is too small. Melancholy suggests sadness. Veod is something quieter. It is the awareness that beauty and impermanence cannot be separated. It is the feeling that arrives precisely because something is beautiful, and because you know it cannot last. This emotion runs silently through much of Nordic painting, not as a subject, as an atmosphere. It cannot be located in a single figure or a single object. It exists between them, like the fading light itself. And once you recognize it, many of these paintings begin to change. A woman walking along the shore is no longer simply taking an evening stroll. A fisherman gazing toward the sea is no longer merely resting after work. A family standing together beneath a pale sky is no longer just a family. They become images of human consciousness suspended between presence and disappearance. The answer was hidden in plain sight, and it changes everything. For generations, viewers believed these artists were painting landscapes. In reality, they were painting the emotional conditions created by landscapes. This distinction may seem subtle. It is not. It marks one of the quiet revolutions of modern art. The French Impressionists asked how light transforms color. The Nordic painters asked how light transforms awareness. That shift reaches far beyond aesthetics. It anticipates ideas that would later emerge in psychology, phenomenology, and even existential philosophy. Long before these disciplines gave us the language, Nordic painters were already asking a profound question. What if the world we experience is shaped as much by our inner condition as by the light that reaches our eyes? You can feel this in the paintings of Anna Ancher, whose interiors are filled with quiet sunlight that seems less interested in illuminating rooms than in revealing states of reflection. You can sense it in the work of Wilhelm Hammershøi, where empty spaces and silent figures make absence itself feel almost tangible. And you can see it most clearly in Krøyer's Blue Hour, where the sea becomes less a place than a state of mind. These artists were not escaping reality. They were discovering another layer of it, one that cannot be measured with rulers or maps, only experienced. Today, neuroscience tells us that perception is never passive. The brain constantly interprets, predicts, filters, and reconstructs the world before we become conscious of it. We do not simply see reality. We participate in creating the reality we see. The Nordic painters arrived at a remarkably similar intuition through observation alone. Winter became their laboratory. Silence became their method. Light became their language. And perhaps that is why their work still feels strangely contemporary. not because it resembles modern life, but because it understands something modern people often forget. That attention itself has a texture, that silence has a color, and that the mind reveals itself most clearly when the world stops demanding to be noticed. The greatest discovery of Nordic Impressionism was never about winter. It was about consciousness. When Impressionism traveled north, many expected nothing more than a regional variation. A different climate, different landscapes, perhaps a cooler palette. Instead, something far more significant happened. The movement itself changed direction. Without announcing a manifesto, without declaring a revolution, without anyone fully realizing it at the time. In France, light revealed the visible world. In Scandinavia, light revealed the invisible one. The artists of Skagen taught us that a landscape can be more than a place. It can become a psychological space, a quiet conversation between memory, perception, and time. That is why their paintings continue to hold us. Not because they show extraordinary events, but because they remind us of experiences we have all had and rarely understood. The stillness before evening, the silence after snowfall, the strange feeling that the world has become larger just as the light begins to fade. Perhaps those moments were never empty. Perhaps they were the moments when our minds were finally quiet enough to notice themselves. The painters of the North did not discover a new color. They discovered a new way of seeing, not outward, inward. And if you ever find yourself standing beside the sea at the end of a winter day, watching the horizon slowly dissolve into blue, you may realize that those artists were never trying to paint the sunset at all. They were painting the brief moment when the world grows dim enough for the human mind to become visible.